The antiseptic bite of the air was the first thing to register, a sterile intrusion into the suffocating fog of his grief. Michael Thompson's eyes fluttered open to the sight of a crisp, white ceiling and the steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor that felt like a mocking metronome, counting the seconds of a life he no longer wanted. And the fourth line snaked into his arm, a tether to a world he kept trying to escape. This was the third time they had pulled him back from the edge, from the quiet peace he craved, from the only place he might find his wife, Alice. He closed his eyes, and she was there. Not the official photograph or one from her Special Forces mission dossier. Stoic and severe, but the real Alice. Her laughter echoing in their sun-drenched kitchen. The scent of cinnamon and coffee in the air. The way she'd tuck a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. The memories were vivid, brutal things. Sharp-edged fragments that carved him up from the inside. They had told him she was gone, lost on a classified operation in 1978. A hero's death with no body to bury. But for Michael, she wasn't a memory. She was a phantom limb, an ache so profound that existence without her was a constant, low-grade torture. She was his everything, the architect of his world, and without her, the magnificent skyscraper of his life was just a hollowed-out shell. A polite knock on his private room door pulled him from the wreckage of his thoughts. A stout woman with a determined glint in her eyes and a portfolio tucked under her arm entered. Mrs. Gable, the matchmaker. She was relentless. A force of nature his well-meaning board of directors had sicced on him. Mr. Thompson, she began, her voice professional but firm. I'm glad to see you're looking better. He didn't answer, just stared at the blank television screen on the wall. I have another proposal, she pressed on, undeterred by his silence. Diane Miller, a kindergarten teacher. Simple, kind, impeccable references. She understands this would be a marriage of convenience, an arrangement. She slid a photograph onto his bedside table. A woman with warm, gentle eyes and a soft, unassuming smile looked up at him. He flinched, pushing it away as if it were hot to the touch. No, Michael rasped, his voice raw. Tell them to stop. Tell everyone to stop. There is no one else. There will only ever be Alice. His devotion was a shield, but it was also the cage that kept him trapped. For months, this had been their ritual. She would propose, and he would reject, clinging to the ghost of his wife like a holy relic. But this time, something was different. The hospital room felt smaller, the air thicker. The cycle of grief and rescue had worn him down to nothing. As Mrs. Gable began to gather her things, a different kind of despair washed over him, not the sharp agony of loss, but the dull, crushing weight of exhaustion. He was tired of fighting, tired of hurting, tired of hoping for an end that never came. The memories of Alice, once a comfort, now felt like embers burning him alive. He looked at the ceiling again, a single, hot tear tracing a path down his temple. The words escaped him in a broken whisper, an exorcism and a surrender all at once. Alice, I won't love you anymore. The declaration hung in the silent room, a vow spoken in reverse. It felt like a betrayal, but staying alive felt like a greater one. He turned his head, his gaze finding Mrs. Gable at the door. Wait, she paused, her hand on the handle. The teacher, he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Diane Miller. Tell her yes. Draw up the papers. I'll marry her. A flicker of surprise crossed Mrs. Gable's face before being replaced by brisk efficiency. Of course, Mr. Thompson. I'll inform her immediately. She gave a curt nod and was gone, leaving him alone with the ghost he had just promised to forsake. The beep of the monitor continued its steady rhythm, but now it sounded less like a clock and more like a countdown to a future he couldn't begin to imagine. Weeks later, the ink on the preliminary marriage contract was barely dry. Michael drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon. He found himself on a quiet, suburban street. Pulled over in front of a modest two-story house, Brian's house. Brian had been Alice's mission partner, the one who delivered the tragic news, his own grief a mirror of Michael's. Michael had kept his distance, the man's presence a painful reminder. But tonight, a morbid curiosity had guided him here. He saw a light on in the living room, and then he saw her, a woman with Alice's unmistakable blonde hair, a slender frame, her graceful movements. He froze, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. It was Michelle, Alice's identical twin sister. He'd only met her a few times. She was the quiet one, the homebody, a stark contrast to Alice's adventurous spirit. It made a strange kind of sense that she would be here, comforting the man who had lost her sister. But this was not comfort, this was intimacy. Brian came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back into him, a soft, contented smile on her face. They moved together with the easy and conscious synchronicity of a long-married couple. They were decorating a nursery. His blood ran cold. Michael cut the engine, the silence in the car suddenly deafening. He rolled down a window, the cool night air doing nothing to quell the firestorm igniting in his chest. A gust of wind carried their voices from the open window of the house. Just a few more weeks, Brian was saying, his voice a low, happy murmur. Her laugh, a sound that shot through Michael like a bullet, was next. He's kicking again. I think he's going to be a soccer player. Just like you wanted then. She said the words that shattered his universe. I'm so glad we did this, Brian. I was so tired of being Alice Scott. The name, her name, spoken as a costume she discarded, hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't Michelle. It had never been Michelle. It was Alice. His Alice. Alive, breathing, pregnant with another man's child. A crushing wave of betrayal obliterated every other emotion. The grief he had nurtured, the despair that had driven him to the brink of death 3 times, it was all based on a lie. A deliberate, cruel, and calculated deception. He remembered standing at the altar, the weight of her hands in his, the solemn promise in her eyes. Till death do us part. She hadn't died. She had simply parted. The profound sorrow that had been his constant companion for 2 years curdled into something else entirely, a seething, white-hot rage. He wasn't a widower mourning a fallen hero. He was a fool, a pawn in a game he never knew he was playing. The foundation of his past crumbled to dust, and the future he had just reluctantly agreed to with a stranger named Diane suddenly felt like the only solid ground in a world that had become a nauseating, spinning lie. The news arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a sickeningly sweet piece of gossip, whispered over celebratory cocktails at a Thompson Court function Michael was forced to attend. Brian, beaming with a proprietary pride that turned Michael's stomach, was accepting congratulations. Michelle's pregnant, he announced, his voice thick with an earned joy. The words echoed in the cavernous ballroom, each syllable a tiny, poisoned dart piercing the fragile armor Michael had constructed around his heart. He watched from the shadows, a ghost at a feast celebrating his own demise. Alice's child. His mind corrected with cold precision, Alice and Brian's child. He saw her across the room, hand resting possessively on her stomach, a serene smile plastered on her face as she accepted well wishes. She was a brilliant actress, playing the part of a lifetime. To everyone else, she was Michelle, the blushing mother-to-be. To Michael, she was the architect of a lie so profound it had warped the very fabric of his reality. He gripped his glass until his knuckles were white, the ice cubes clinking a frantic, silent rhythm against the crystal, a sound only he could hear. Weeks later, the call came in the dead of night, a sterile voice on the other end of the line shattering his fitful sleep. Mr. Thompson. It's St. Jude's Hospital. We have a Michelle Peterson here. There's been a complication with her pregnancy. She's losing blood. And she needs a transfusion. She's B negative. Our records show you're a match. The request was a cruel twist of irony. He was the only one who could save her. Save the life she had built on the ashes of his own. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to let fate run its course. But the memory of Alice, his Alice, the one who existed before this monstrous deception, wouldn't let him. He drove to the hospital in a daze. The city lights a blur of indifferent color. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit room, he lay on a gurney, a thin curtain separating him from her. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He focused instead on the crimson liquid snaking through a plastic tube. His life force, his very blood, draining from his arm. It flowed away from him and toward the woman who had shattered him. A chilling, physical manifestation of his unwilling sacrifice. He was literally nurturing the child of her betrayal, sustaining the life of another man's heir. The thought was a venom that spread through his veins, colder than the antiseptic wiping his skin. When it was over, a nurse guided him to a chair. Exhausted and hollow, he sat, hidden from view. Through a crack in the door to Alice's room, he saw Brian rush in, his face a mask of concern. Michael watched as Brian knelt by her bed, stroking her hair, pressing a kiss to her forehead before resting his hand on her belly. "Is the baby okay?" Brian whispered. Alice smiled weakly, her hand covering his. "We're fine. Both of us." The intimacy of the scene, the casual tenderness, was a blade twisting in his gut. That was supposed to be him. Those were the plans they had made, the future they had mapped out on countless nights, whispering dreams to each other in the dark. Now, he was just a spectator, a blood bank for a life he was never meant to be a part of. The jealousy was a physical ache, a crushing weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. The fall came faster than anyone expected. News reports began to surface about a major scandal in the city's urban development office, focused on forged resettlement permits. Brian's name was at the center of the storm. Michael watched the story unfold with a detached sense of dread. He knew Alice. He knew her capacity for self-preservation. The knock on his office door was sharp, official. Two detectives stood in the doorway, their faces grim and unreadable. "Michael Thompson," one asked, though it wasn't a question. "You're under arrest in connection with the fraudulent issuance of resettlement permits." Confusion warred with a sudden, sickening understanding. "That's absurd," Michael managed, his voice sounding distant. "I have nothing to do with that. We have a signed confession from your key accomplice," the second detective said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. She was very convincing. "Said you masterminded the whole thing and coerced her into it." And Miss Michelle Peterson, the cold metal clamped around his wrists, sealing his fate. Alice. She had sacrificed him, the man she once claimed to love more than life itself. She had thrown to the wolves to save her new life, her new man. As they led him through the bustling office, past the shocked and whispering faces of his employees, all he could think of were her past vows, her tearful promises of undying love. They were all just words, intricate pieces of a grand deception. Days later, she appeared at his jail cell, a phantom in the grey, oppressive silence. She looked pale, her pregnancy more pronounced. Tears streamed down her face, but they seemed rehearsed, a part of the performance. "Michael, I am so sorry," she whispered through the visitation glass, her voice trembling. "They were going to take Brian away. I couldn't let our baby be born with a father in prison. I had no choice." He stared at her, his face a stone mask. The pain inside him was so immense it had become a void, a black hole where his heart used to be. He saw it all with horrifying clarity. Her choice had been simple. It was him or Brian, and she had chosen. "I'll fix this," she promised, her voice a desperate, hollow echo in the sterile room. As soon as the baby is born and Brian is safe, I'll tell them the truth. I'll come back for you. I swear it. Michael said nothing. He just watched her. This stranger wearing the face of the woman he loved. He watched her spin one last, beautiful lie, a final, gilded nail in his coffin. When she turned and walked away, her empty promise hung in the air, a poisonous vapor that choked the last vestiges of his hope. He was alone, entombed in concrete and steel, betrayed by ghosts. The clinking of silverware against porcelain felt like a countdown. Michael sat opposite the woman he had once believed was his wife's supportive twin sister, Michelle, but now knew to be Alice herself, living a lie. The restaurant was an upscale bistro, all dark wood and low lighting, a place designed for intimacy that now felt like a cage. Alice, her belly gently rounding beneath her designer blouse, scanned the menu with a detached air. The seared tuna with sesame crust sounds divine, she said, her voice smooth, oblivious. And the sesame noodles for an appetizer. A cold dread called in Michael's stomach. Alice, he started, his voice a low warning. I'm Michelle, she corrected sharply, not looking up. And don't be difficult. I'm craving it. He didn't have time to argue. The waiter took their order, and Michael's mind raced. Did she truly not remember, after all their years together? Had she forgotten the one thing that could kill him? The dishes arrived, fragrant and artfully arranged. He watched, frozen, as she took a bite of the noodles, blissfully unaware of the poison she had just placed on their table. He ate his own plain grilled chicken, his appetite gone, his focus entirely on keeping his distance from the scattered seeds. But it was too late. A single, errant sesame seed, transferred by a shared serving spoon or a careless chef, was all it took. The reaction was immediate and violent, a prickling in his throat, a sudden tightness in his chest. He gasped, the air refusing to enter his lungs. His vision blurred at the edges as he fumbled for his EpiPen, his hands shaking too hard to grip it. Alice looked up, her expression shifting from annoyance to a flicker of something unreadable panic. Killed. He couldn't tell before the world went dark. He woke to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic, lonely beep of a heart monitor. The hospital room was washed in the flat, impersonal light of dawn. He was alone. Hours bled into a full day. Then two, no calls, no visitors. The flowers on the windowsill were from his executive assistant. The crushing weight of abandonment settled over him, heavier than any physical ailment. He wasn't just sick, he was forgotten. On the third day, the door was left slightly ajar, and the hushed conversation of two nurses drifted in. Room 304. The anaphylaxis patient. One said, still no sign of his wife. Can you believe it? He almost died. And she hasn't even called. I heard she's pregnant. The other whispered back, probably busy with the new boyfriend. Some people are just cold. A word struck him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just his reality. It was a pathetic, observable fact. A piece of hospital gossip. He was the man whose wife left him to die. The profound humiliation burned hotter than any fever. When Alice finally appeared that evening, her concern was so transparently false it was insulting. Michael, I was so worried, she began, her hand hovering over his. He pulled his arm away, his eyes like ice. Were you just worried Brian would find out you were having dinner with your supposedly dead husband? Her face hardened. The charade was over. What do you want, Michael? I want you to sign the divorce papers, he said, his voice flat and devoid of its old warmth. And then I want you to disappear. I'm marrying Diane. We're leaving the country. And we are never coming back. Alice blinked, a flicker of genuine shock crossing her features. Diane, that mousy little charity worker. You can't be serious. You're just hurt. You don't love her, love. He let out a harsh, empty laugh. You taught me everything I need to know about what love isn't. It isn't forgetting an allergy that could kill me. It isn't faking your own death. And it damn sure isn't abandoning me in a hospital bed to be with the man whose child you're carrying. He pointed toward the door, his entire being radiating a chilling finality. Get out. She opened her mouth to argue, to manipulate. But the look in his eyes stopped her. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and, therefore, nothing she could take. She turned and walked away, leaving him in the echoing silence of the room. That night, Diane sat by his bedside, her presence a quiet bomb on his raw nerves. She didn't press or pry. She just held his hand, her touch gentle and sure. She doesn't deserve you, Diane whispered, a voice thick with an emotion she'd held back for years. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the depth of her sincerity. Why, Diane, why have you always been there? Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn, leather-bound bank book, placing it in his lap. I started this account when I was 10 years old, the first time you shared your lunch with me because I forgot mine. I've been putting money into it every month for 25 years. Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. I saved it to build a life. I always hoped it would be with you. Michael stared at the passbook, at the neat columns of deposits spanning decades. It was a testament to a love that was patient, selfless, and absolute. A love he had been too blind to see. In that moment, the last of the ice around his heart cracked. He saw not a replacement for Alice, but a genuine hope for a new beginning. A week later, they stood before a marriage officiant in a simple government office on Bain Island. The room was bright, filled with sunlight that streamed through the large windows. Are you certain you're ready for this? Diane asked softly, her eyes searching his. He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. I've never been more certain of anything. They set the date for 1 month from that day, their shared enthusiasm a stark contrast to the darkness that had defined his life. Walking out into the sunshine, Michael finally understood. His marriage to Alice hadn't been a partnership, it had been a dependency. He had relied on her vibrancy, her ambition, her very presence, without ever realizing she had never truly seen him, never known the man behind the CEO. She didn't know his fears, his dreams, or even the simple things that could end his life. Diane, however, knew it all. She had been watching, caring, and loving him from the sidelines his entire life. He stopped on the steps, turning to face her. He took both of her hands in his grip firm and full of promise. For the first time, he said, his voice clear and strong, I am genuinely looking forward to my own wedding. He brought her hand to his lips, his gaze locked with hers. I promise you, Diane, this time, only death can do us part. The crisp, salt-tinged air of Bain Island felt like a cleansing breath. Inside the clean, minimalist lines of the marriage registration office, a camera flash punctuated the quiet, immortalizing the moment. Michael Thompson, his posture straight and his gaze soft, held Diane Miller's hand. Her simple, OTHERW white dress seemed to radiate a light of its own, a stark contrast to the designer gowns that had once populated his world. They posed for the official photograph, their faces a portrait of relief and a happiness so profound it felt fragile. A single tear traced a path down Diane's cheek. Catching the light, she quickly wiped it away, her smile trembling. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as they stepped away from the stark white backdrop. It's just, I'm so happy. I'm scared I'll wake up. Michael stopped, turning to face her fully. He gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbones. The shadows that had haunted his eyes for so long were gone, replaced by an unwavering clarity. This is real, Diane, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor. You are real. What we have is real. You saved me from a nightmare. You would never be one. Her Cinderella moment wasn't about a grand ball or a glass slipper. It was here, in the quiet authenticity of his gaze. It was the realization that she wasn't a temporary fix or a placeholder, but the destination. Outside, the ocean stretched to the horizon. A brilliant, impossible blue. They walked along a cliffside path, the sea breeze toying with the hem of her dress. Michael pressed a small, fall-wrapped candy into her palm, a local tradition for newlyweds. She unwrapped it and did the same for him, their fingers brushing. The sweet, simple taste of almond and honey felt more significant than any champagne toast. He watched as she laughed, a pure, unburdened sound that the wine seemed to carry out over the water. She wasn't performing. She wasn't posturing, she simply was. Her love was as constant and unassuming as the tide. And in its presence, he finally felt whole. The ghost of Alice, the woman he thought he'd loved, had been a phantom of ambition and intricate performance. Diane was truth. When we get back, he said, pulling her close, his voice filled with a conviction that settled deep in her soul. We'll have a wedding. A real one, so grand and so public that no one in this world will ever doubt for a second that you are Mrs. Diane Thompson, my wife. She leaned her head against his chest, closing her eyes and breathing in the scent of his cologne mixed with the sea. This is enough, she murmured, just this, just you. He held her tighter. It's a start. Their private paradise was meant to be sealed at a small, elegant ceremony later that afternoon at their resort. Before a handful of Michael's closest family and loyal friends who had flown in, they stood under a canopy of white orchids, the ocean serving as their witness. The officiant had just begun to speak of union and devotion when a voice, sharp and frantic, sliced through the serene atmosphere. Michael, stop. You can't do this. Heads turned, gasps rippled through the small gathering. There, at the edge of the manicured lawn, stood Alice, or rather, the woman who had once been Alice. She was no longer the polished, perfect wife he remembered, nor the grieving twin sister Michelle she had pretended to be. This woman was a storm of desperation. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her hair a mess, and her eyes held a wild, possessive fire. She was visibly pregnant, her condition a glaring testament to the life she had chosen. She pushed past a stunned security guard, her gaze locked on Michael. Michael, please, it's me, your wife. How can you do this to us, to our memory? Diane's hand instinctively tightened in Michael's. He didn't let go. Instead, he squeezed back, a silent promise, and stepped slightly in front of her, shielding her. His face was a mask of cold, settled resolve. The grief was gone. The love was gone. All that remained was the bitter clarity of betrayal. You are not my wife, he stated, his voice devoid of heat, carrying the chilling finality of a judge's sentence. My wife died. You made sure of that. No. I was lost. I was confused. Alice pleaded, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch as she took another step forward. She pointed a trembling finger at Diane. And you took advantage of him. You're nothing. A nobody who saw a chance to steal my life. Before Michael could respond, his mother, Eleanor Thompson, rose from her seat in the front row. Her pose was formidable, a voice like ice. Your life, the one you faked your death to escape. The one where you ran off with another man and got pregnant while my son was trying to kill himself over you. An uncle of Michael's, who had known Alice and her twins since they were girls, stood as well. We know everything, Michelle. Or is it Alice today? We have the flight manifests, the bank records showing the money you funneled, the testimony from the mission chief you bribed. Your grand deception is over. The words struck Alice like physical blows. Each revelation, spoken calmly and publicly, unraveled her reality thread by thread. The guests murmured, their faces a mixture of pity and disgust. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing into a pile of sordid, undeniable facts. No, no, it's not true, she stammered, looking wildly from face to face, searching for an ally, for any sign of belief. She found none. She turned back to Michael, her final, desperate gambit. Michael, our love, it meant something, tell them. It meant something to me, he replied, his voice slow and cutting. To you, it was a stepping stone. You used my name, my resources and my heart. And when you found a better offer, you threw it all away and orchestrated a tragedy to cover your tracks. The finality in his tone was the breaking point. A gut-wrenching sob tore from Alice's throat, her face contorted in a mask of pure agony, the agony not of a lost love, but of a failed con. She clutched her stomach, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as her knees buckled. A wave of pain washed over her features, stark and terrifying. Something's wrong, she choked out, her hands pressing against her womb. The public spectacle dissolved into chaos and horror. As she crumpled to the grass, the terrible truth became apparent. The emotional and physical strain had culminated in the most tragic of consequences. Amidst the frantic calls for a medic, her own parents, who had arrived hoping to salvage their family's reputation, rushed to her side. But their faces held no comfort, only shame and fury. Look what you've done, her father hissed, his voice trembling with rage as medics carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. You've ruined us. You've ruined everything with your selfishness and your lies. Alice, pale and semi-conscious, could only weep as she was carried away, her last desperate attempt to reclaim her old life ending in utter ruin and devastating loss. The silence that fell over the wedding party was heavy and absolute. The beautiful ceremony was now a scene of scandal and tragedy. But as the ambulance's siren faded into the distance, Michael turned away from the wreckage of his past. He turned back to Diane. Her eyes were wide, filled with shock and a deep, sorrowful empathy. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her face. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a scarred landscape, but they were still standing together. It's over, he said, his voice soft but firm, a vow more powerful than any they could have recited. He took both of her hands in his grip a reassurance of unshakable commitment. It's just us now. Diane looked up at him, her love a quiet, resilient flame that not even this hurricane could extinguish. She nodded, a slow, certain movement. In the ruins of one life, theirs was just beginning. The antiseptic scent of the hospital room was a poor mask for the stench of decay, not of the body, but of a life, a family, a future. Brian stood over his sister's bed, his tailored suit rumpled, his face a ruin of sleepless nights and public disgrace. The empire his father had built was crumbling, its foundations corroded by the acid of Alice's lies. You will marry me, he said, his voice stripped of all brotherly affection, leaving only the raw grit of a desperate business transaction. It's the only way to salvage something from this inferno you've created. We merge what's left of our assets, present a united front, a story of reconciliation, of family solidarity in the face of a terrible misunderstanding. Alice, propped against the starched pillows, looked at him with an unnerving placidity. Her hand rested protectively on the slight swell of her stomach, the last, catastrophic piece of her failed scheme. Don't be ridiculous, Brian. I am Mrs. Michael Thompson. I always will be. He filed for divorce this morning. Brian's voice cracked, a fissure in his carefully constructed composure. The papers were delivered an hour ago. The world knows you faked your death. They know you assumed your dead sister's identity. They know that child isn't his. There is no Mrs. Michael Thompson anymore. There is only Alice Vaughan, the woman who destroyed everything she touched. A chin lifted, a gesture of regal defiance that looked utterly pathetic in the sterile, unforgiving light. He's hurt. He's confused. He loves me. He just needs time to remember that. Once this Diane is out of the picture, he will come back. A soft click of the latch cut through the tension. The door swung inward, and the air in the room seemed to solidify. Michael Thompson stood on the threshold, his presence filling the space with an authority that dwarfed Brian's frantic energy. He was impeccably dressed in a dark grey suit, his posture radiating a calm that was more terrifying than any rage. Beside him, her hand resting gently in the crook of his arm, was Diane. She wasn't wearing a suit of armor, but the simple elegance of her dress and the quiet strength in her eyes made her look invincible. She was his anchor, and it was clear to everyone in the room that he was no longer adrift. Brian took an involuntary step back, his bluster evaporating. Alice's delusional calm, however, fractured into a desperate, hopeful smile. "Michael," she breathed, trying to sit up straighter. "I knew you'd come." Michael's eyes, once clouded with grief and confusion, were now clear as ice. He gave Brian a dismissive glance. "You should leave. This is between Alice and me. It wasn't a request." Brian, for the first time in his life looking utterly defeated, hesitated for a moment before turning and walking out, closing the door softly behind him, sealing the three of them in. Michael and Diane walked closer to the bed, stopping a few feet away, a clear, uncrossable boundary. "You didn't just lie, Alice," Michael began, his voice low and devoid of passion. It was the voice of a man delivering a final verdict, not arguing a case. "You conducted a funeral. You made me bury you. You watched me try to kill myself because I couldn't live in a world without you. And you did nothing." Tears welled in Alice's eyes, the first genuine emotion she had shown. "I was scared. I made a mistake, Michael. A terrible mistake. But we can fix this. We can go back." "Go back to what?" he asked, a flicker of something pity, perhaps in his gaze. "The lies, the manipulation, the life you threw away for a fantasy. There is no past to return to. You burned it to the ground." He paused, his eyes finding hers, and he delivered the final, fatal blow to her hope. "That child you're carrying deserves a father who isn't a pawn in its mother's game. But that man will never be me." A choked, guttural sound tore from her throat. Her gaze darted to Diane, her eyes filling with a venomous hatred. "It's her, isn't it? This plain nobody girl. She posing you against me." Michael's hand tightened over Diane's. He didn't look at Alice again. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his profile resolute, and spoke to Diane, though his words were meant to echo in the room forever. "My life began again the day I met Diane. She didn't save me from you, Alice. She saved me from myself. She showed me what honesty feels like, what trust feels like, what love, real love, feels like." He finally turned his gaze back to the woman in the bed, the ghost who had haunted him for so long. "I came here to say goodbye, not to the woman I loved, because that woman never really existed. I'm saying goodbye to the lie. My future," he said, his voice softening with an unmistakable tenderness as he looked at Diane, "is with her." With that, he turned. Diane met his eyes, a world of understanding passing between them, and together they walked out of the room. They didn't run. They didn't look back. He didn't need to see the wreckage. He had lived in it long enough. Alice's wail, a sound of pure, undiluted loss, was cut off as the door clicked shut behind them, leaving her alone with the consequences of her choices, a queen reigning over an empire of ashes. The sterile white of the hospital dissolved into the soft blues and golds of a new dawn. Months had passed, seasons had turned, and the scandal had faded into yesterday's news. Dane Island wasn't just a location. It was a sanctuary. The sprawling, modern house Michael had built sat nestled in the cliffs, its glass walls offering an uninterrupted view of the endless ocean. It was a home built not on a legacy of wealth, but on a foundation of peace. Diane stood on the veranda, a thick cashmere sweater wrapped around her, a ceramic mug warming her hands. The sea air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Michael came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He smelled of coffee and clean linen, the scent of their new life. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured into her hair. She leaned back against his chest, her soft smile touching her lips. "Just everything. How quiet it is." It was true. The silence here wasn't empty, it was full. It was filled with the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore, the cry of gulls, the gentle hum of a life lived deliberately, away from the noise of the world they had left behind. "No more ghosts?" he asked, his voice a gentle probe. She shook her head, turning in his arms to face him. "No, they can't cross the water." She looked into his eyes, seeing the man he was now calm, centered, his happiness a quiet, steady flame rather than a brilliant, unstable fire. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a profound sense of contentment that radiated from him. He lifted her left hand, his thumb tracing the simple, elegant gold band on her finger. It wasn't a diamond meant to impress the world, but a perfect, unbroken circle meant only for them. "This looks right on you," he said softly, like it was always meant to be there. "It feels right," she agreed, her heart swelling with a love so pure and steady it felt like the tide itself. "Everything with you feels right." Their life was beautifully, wonderfully ordinary. They took long walks on the private beach, cooked dinner together while arguing playfully over recipes, and read side by side in front of the stone fireplace on chilly nights. He still ran his global enterprise, but now he did it from a state-of-the-art office overlooking the sea. His priorities irrevocably shifted. His work funded their life. It no longer was his life. He lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both familiar and new. It held the comfort of 1,000 shared moments and the quiet promise of countless more. When they parted, he kept his forehead pressed against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool morning air.